"They will bear you children," said the chief. The rancher let them stay. The day the chief arrived at the rancher's doorstep, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the fields. The rancher, a man used to the quiet rhythm of the land, had been working under the hot sun all day. His hands, worn from years of hard labor, brushed the dirt from his shirt as he looked out over the horizon. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the wind through the grass and the distant call of a hawk. When the chief approached, the rancher didn't immediately recognize him. The man had a presence about him, tall and strong, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of many years. There was an aura of wisdom and command in his steps, as though the earth itself had shaped him. The chief was a figure out of stories. His weathered face spoke of a life lived with purpose, and the silence in his eyes hinted at the burdens he carried. The rancher, though not one for many words, greeted him with a simple nod. He wasn't sure what to expect, but something about the chief's quiet strength made him pause. The chief, standing tall, offered a greeting of his own, his voice steady but filled with the weight of something unspoken. "I have come to ask for your help," the chief began, his tone firm but not demanding. "My people have traveled far, and we have nowhere to go. Our land is barren, the soil is dry, and the rivers no longer run. We've tried, but the land does not yield to us anymore. I ask that you allow us to stay, for a while, perhaps longer if you can." The rancher studied him quietly. He had heard stories of the tribe, of their strength and resilience, but he had never truly interacted with them. His life, simple and solitary, revolved around cattle, the land, and the seasons. His home was his sanctuary, and he had always guarded it fiercely. Still, there was something in the chief's voice, something that made the rancher hesitate. He knew the chief would not come unless he was desperate, and desperation often carried a truth no words could capture. The rancher, a man who preferred his solitude, thought about the words for a long moment. He had no family, no children of his own, and no deep ties to anyone. His life had been about hard work maintaining his land and finding peace in the quiet. He was not used to visitors, much less an entire tribe seeking refuge. But the chief's presence was not one that could be easily dismissed. There was an understanding between them, unspoken but clear. The rancher knew that turning him away would not be so simple. "You may stay," the rancher said at last, his voice quiet but steady. "But I ask that you respect the land and my ways. I do not have much, but what I have, I will share. I cannot promise you much beyond that, but you will have shelter for now." The chief nodded solemnly, his eyes reflecting gratitude and understanding. He did not ask for more. The silence between them stretched for a few moments before the chief spoke again. "They will bear you children," he said, his words direct and weighty. The rancher blinked, unsure if he had heard the chief correctly. The words hung in the air, confusing and unexpected. The rancher frowned, trying to understand the meaning behind them. Was the chief referring to the children of his people? The rancher had never thought about the future in such terms. His life had been about survival, about ensuring that his land stayed intact and that he could continue working. The idea of children, of legacy, was something far removed from his thoughts. But the chief did not elaborate. He simply stood there, waiting for the rancher to respond. After a long silence, the rancher nodded, though his mind was still spinning with confusion. He did not fully understand what the chief meant, but there was a sense of resolve in the chief's eyes. Whatever the chief had said, it carried weight. The rancher could not ignore it. That evening, as the chief's people began to settle into their new home, the rancher went about his usual evening routine. The sun sank lower in the sky, and the stars began to twinkle overhead. The fire crackled as he sat by it, his thoughts still heavy with the encounter. He didn't fully know what had brought the chief to his land or why the chief had said those words, but he knew that something had changed. His quiet life, one he had worked so hard to build, had been interrupted, and the future no longer seemed as simple as it had the day before. The chief's people began to settle in, setting up their temporary camp near the barn. The rancher watched them from a distance, unsure how to proceed. He had agreed to let them stay, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. This was no ordinary visit. This was a turning point, though the rancher had no way of knowing just how deeply this decision would shape the years to come. Over the next few days, the tribe's people worked alongside the rancher, helping where they could. The rancher, though still uncertain, found that their presence did not feel entirely unwelcome. They worked hard, respected the land, and kept to themselves. There was an understanding, a quiet acknowledgement between the rancher and the chief's people. Though they came from different worlds, they shared a bond now, a bond forged in necessity and survival. Still, the rancher could not shake the chief's words, "They will bear you children."
What did that mean? Was it a blessing?
A warning? He wasn't sure. But he knew the chief had said it for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was not something to be ignored. As the days passed, the rancher found himself growing more comfortable with the tribe's presence. The children, full of energy and curiosity, would often come around the ranch, asking questions about the land, the animals, and the work that needed to be done. They were eager to learn, and though the rancher had never been one for teaching, he found himself showing them the basics of ranch life. There was something about their innocence, their unspoken respect, that made it impossible to turn them away. The rancher noticed that, little by little, his life was changing. He no longer worked alone. The sound of children laughing, of the tribe's people sharing stories around the fire, filled the air. It was a sound he hadn't realized he had been missing. Though his solitude had always been a comfort to him, now there was a new warmth in his life, a warmth that came from the presence of others. Still, the rancher could not shake the chief's words, "They will bear you children." He pondered them in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. What did they mean for his future? Was this the beginning of something new? Was it simply the chief's way of saying that their people would share in the future of the land, just as the rancher had? Or was there something deeper to it? Something he was not yet ready to understand? Whatever the meaning, the rancher knew one thing for certain. His life was no longer just his own. The chief's people had come, and they were here to stay. The bond between them had already begun to take shape, and there was no going back. The rancher had made his decision, and now the future was unfolding in a way he had never expected. As the days grew into weeks, the rancher realized that the chief's visit had changed him. He had opened his life to others, and in doing so, he had discovered something he hadn't even known he was missing. But the true meaning of the chief's words still eluded him, lingering in the background of his mind, waiting for the right moment to make itself clear. As the days passed, the rancher grew more accustomed to the presence of the chief's people. At first he had been hesitant, unsure of how to interact with them, or even if he should. But their quiet work ethic and willingness to help began to break down the walls he had built around himself. The tribe's people did not demand anything from him. They simply worked alongside him in silence, understanding that their survival here depended on cooperation. The chief, too, seemed content with the arrangement. He did not come to the rancher often, but when he did, it was always with a look of understanding, as if he knew exactly what was going through the rancher's mind. The chief's people were scattered throughout the land, setting up small camps near the barn, and the rancher found himself working harder than usual. But not alone. The days were long, and the work was exhausting. But there was something satisfying about it. The rancher had never been one for much company, but now he found himself surrounded by people. He heard their voices in the wind, saw their movements in the distance, and found himself beginning to appreciate the life they had brought to the land. He was used to the solitude of his ranch, but now there was a new energy in the air. The children of the tribe were always curious, always asking questions. They would wander over to the rancher's cattle, watching him work, and he would answer their questions, even though he had never thought of himself as a teacher. He showed them how to handle the animals, how to care for them, and how to treat the land with respect. He found that the children were eager to learn, and their enthusiasm reminded him of the innocence and simplicity of life. The chief's words still lingered in the back of his mind, though. "They will bear you children." He had thought about it often, trying to understand what the chief meant. Was it a blessing, a statement about the future? Or perhaps it was a simple remark about the tribe's children. The rancher didn't know, but it weighed heavily on him. He had never been one for family or children. His life had always been about work, about survival, about maintaining the land. He never thought about what might come after. But as the days went by, he started to notice the changes in himself. The tribe's people had brought a sense of warmth to the ranch that he had never known. He found himself caring about them in a way he had not expected. He cared about their well-being, their safety, and their happiness. He found himself sharing meals with them, sitting around the fire and listening to their stories of faraway places. They would sing songs of their ancestors, songs that spoke of the land, of battles fought, and of lives lived in harmony with nature. And in those moments, the rancher began to realize that there was more to life than just working the land. He had lived a simple life, focusing on the physical aspects of his work. But now he was learning about the deeper connections that could be formed between people. He began to understand the tribe's culture, the way they respected the land, and the way they took care of one another. It was a way of life that had been lost to many, and the rancher found himself captivated by it. He had spent so many years working alone, but now he was part of something much larger than himself. The chief's words echoed in his mind, and the rancher began to wonder if there was more truth to them than he had first realized. "They will bear you children." The phrase seemed to take on a new meaning as he spent more time with the tribe. It wasn't just about the children of the tribe. It was about a connection, a bond that went beyond bloodlines. It was about the future, about the generations that would follow, and about the land that would continue to sustain them all. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep orange, the rancher found himself sitting by the fire with the chief. They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. The chief's eyes were fixed on the fire, but the rancher could tell he was deep in thought. "I've been thinking," the rancher said, his voice quiet but steady, "about your words. They will bear you children." The chief glanced at him, his expression unreadable, but the rancher saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "What did you mean by that?" the rancher asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. The chief took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving the fire. "It is not about blood, but about legacy," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "The children who are born to us are not just ours. They are the children of the land, of the earth. They will carry our stories, our traditions, and our way of life. They will remember what we have done, and they will pass it on. That is the true meaning of children." The rancher listened carefully, processing the chief's words. It was a new way of thinking for him. He had always seen children as something to be protected, something to care for, but he had never thought about them as carriers of legacy. He had never thought about what his own legacy might be, or how his life might affect those who came after him. The chief continued, "We as a people are connected to the land, and the land will always give back to us. But it is not just the land that we must care for. It is the people who live on it, the children, the future. They are the ones who will continue the work. They are the ones who will remember our teachings." The rancher felt a shift in his heart as he listened. It was a humbling realization. He had lived his life with a narrow focus on the present, on his own survival. But now, he understood that life was about more than just survival. It was about living in harmony with others and with the land, and it was about passing that knowledge on to future generations. Over the next few weeks, the rancher began to see the chief's words in a different light. He observed how the tribe's people cared for their children, how they taught them the ways of the land, and how they respected the earth. The children were not just being raised to survive. They were being raised to understand their place in the world, to appreciate the land, and to carry on the traditions of their people. As the rancher watched the children, he saw something he had never seen before: a sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than themselves. The tribe's children were not just growing up in a world of hard work and survival. They were growing up with a sense of belonging, with a sense of community. They were learning that their lives had meaning beyond themselves, that they were part of a larger story that had been written long before they were born. The rancher's thoughts began to shift. He started to see the land not just as something to be worked, but as something to be cherished, something to be passed down. He began to think about his own life, about his own legacy and what he wanted to leave behind. And as he thought about the future, he realized that the chief's words were true. The children of the tribe, the children of the land, would carry on what he had started. They would bear his legacy, just as he would bear theirs. As the weeks turned into months, the rancher's life began to change in ways he had never expected. The presence of the tribe, once an uneasy and unfamiliar burden, had now become an integral part of his daily routine. The chief's people had settled into the rhythm of the land, and the rancher, despite his initial reluctance, had found himself working alongside them. He had come to see that their way of life, though different from his own, was not something to be feared, but something to be understood. The tribe's strength was in its unity, its shared bond with the land and with each other. The rancher's days were no longer solitary. Mornings began with the sounds of laughter and the busy hustle of the tribe's children as they helped with the chores, gathering wood, tending to the animals, or carrying water. At first, the rancher had hesitated to involve them in his work. He had always done things on his own, in silence, with a methodical precision. But now, as he worked alongside the children, he began to see them as part of the future, just as the chief had said. They weren't just helping him. They were learning, growing, and taking part in something larger than themselves. One day, as he worked with the tribe's young ones near the cattle, a boy approached him shyly. The rancher looked down at him, noticing the dirt on his face and the eagerness in his eyes. The boy had been watching him carefully for days, trying to understand the ways of the ranch, and now he wanted to learn. "Will you teach me?" the boy asked softly, his voice filled with both curiosity and hope. The rancher was taken aback. He had never thought of himself as a teacher. He had never been one to share his knowledge, to pass it on to others. But as he looked into the boy's earnest face, something stirred within him. Perhaps this was what the chief had meant when he said the children would bear a legacy. It wasn't about blood, about passing on a name, but about passing on knowledge, a way of life. Without thinking, the rancher nodded. "All right, but you have to listen closely. There's a right way to do everything here, and you have to pay attention." The boy's face lit up, and from that moment on he worked alongside the rancher every day, learning how to handle the cattle, how to maintain the fences, and how to respect the land. The rancher found himself teaching the boy things he had never thought to explain before. He realized that much of what he had learned over the years had been absorbed through experience, not through words. But now, for the first time, he was forced to articulate his knowledge, to pass it on. And as he did, he began to see the land in a new light. It wasn't just his to work anymore. It was part of something much larger. The boy, eager to learn, became his apprentice, and the rancher found that teaching him was not a burden, but a privilege. The days began to blend together. The rancher's life was no longer a solitary one, but one shared with the tribe. There were still moments of quiet, moments when he could step away from the work and reflect on the changes in his life. But even in those moments, he could hear the voices of the tribe's people in the background, and it was no longer a sound he wanted to escape. One evening, as the sun began to set, the rancher found himself sitting by the fire with the chief once again. The flames crackled in the silence, and the rancher's thoughts turned inward. He had come a long way since the chief had first arrived, and now, more than ever, he understood the chief's words. The tribe's people were not just visitors. They had become part of his life, and the children, the future, were no longer distant figures in his mind. They were real living beings, and they were growing up under his watchful eye. "You are right," the rancher said, breaking the silence. "About the children. They are the future. They're learning, just like you said." The chief's face softened, and he nodded. "They are. But it is not just about learning the ways of the land. It is about understanding the responsibilities that come with it. We are not just here to survive. We are here to care for the land, to nurture it, and to pass it on." The rancher's thoughts drifted to the boy he had been teaching. He had already learned so much, and yet there was still so much more to show him. But the rancher realized something important. It was not just about teaching the boy how to work the land. It was about teaching him the importance of respect, of understanding the delicate balance between nature and humanity. "I've never thought about it that way," the rancher admitted. "I've always seen this place as mine, something I work for myself." But now I see that it's more than just mine. It belongs to everyone who lives here." The chief smiled, his eyes warm with approval. "That is the way of our people. The land is not just something we take from, it is something we give back to. We are not here to own it, but to live in harmony with it." As the seasons changed, so too did the rancher's outlook on life. He had always been a man of few words, a man who kept to himself and worked tirelessly to maintain the ranch. But now he found himself opening up, sharing stories with the tribe, and even laughing with the children as they helped him with the work. The rancher had never known what it was like to be part of a community, but now he couldn't imagine life without it. The boy he had taught had grown in ways that surprised the rancher. He was no longer the shy, timid child who had first approached him. Now he was confident, capable, and ready to take on more responsibility. The rancher saw in him the same qualities that had drawn him to the land all those years ago: a quiet determination, a deep respect for nature, and a willingness to work hard. One afternoon the rancher stood by the cattle, watching as the boy expertly guided the animals into the pen. The rancher's chest swelled with pride. This was what it was all about: the future, the legacy, the land that they would all share. The boy was no longer just his student. He was becoming his equal, and the rancher could see that one day he would take over the ranch, just as the chief had taken over the leadership of his people. And with that thought, the rancher realized that the chief's words had come true. The children of the tribe would indeed bear him a legacy, but not in the way he had originally imagined. They would not bear his name or his bloodline. Instead, they would bear his knowledge, his respect for the land, and his commitment to building a future for all who called it home. As the seasons changed and the years passed, the rancher found peace in the knowledge that the land would continue, that the children would carry on the traditions of both the tribe and the rancher. And with that peace came the understanding that his life had been a part of something much larger than he had ever imagined. The rancher had become part of a shared story, one that would continue long after he was gone. As the years passed, the rancher began to feel a growing sense of contentment he had never experienced before. The land, once a place of solitary work, had transformed into a thriving home for not just him, but the chief's people too. The rancher had lived most of his life alone, but now he found himself surrounded by a sense of family, one that had been built through hard work, shared experiences, and a deep respect for the land. The chief's words, once cryptic and confusing, now seemed clear to the rancher. "They will bear you children," the chief had said. The rancher had thought of this phrase in so many ways over the past years. But he had come to realize that it wasn't about the children bearing his name. It wasn't about blood or inheritance. It was about something much more profound, something that went beyond mere survival. The children of the tribe and the land would carry the knowledge, respect, and understanding he had passed on, and they would continue to care for the land, just as he had. One evening, as the rancher sat by the fire, the wind carrying the scent of the earth and the sounds of the land around him, he reflected on how much had changed. The chief's people had not only become part of his life, but they had become a part of the land itself. The rancher's bond with the tribe had grown stronger, and the tribe had become a part of his legacy. The once lonely ranch had transformed into a place of gathering, where both the tribe and the rancher's family would come together to share stories, food, and laughter. But with this sense of peace, there was also a growing concern. The seasons were changing in ways the rancher had never experienced before. The weather had grown increasingly unpredictable, and the once fertile land had begun to show signs of strain. The rains had become less frequent, and the soil, once rich and full of life, had started to dry up. The animals, once healthy and strong, were beginning to struggle. The rancher had always prided himself on his ability to care for the land, but now even he was beginning to worry. One day, as the rancher stood at the edge of the fields, watching the sun rise over the horizon, the chief approached him. His face was serious, and the weight of what was to come hung in the air between them. The chief had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was as if every syllable carried a deeper meaning. "We are in trouble," the chief said, his voice steady but filled with concern. "The land is not giving us what we need. The rain does not come and the animals are weak. If we do not find a way to help the land, all that we have built will be lost." The rancher looked out over the fields, his heart heavy. He had always known that the land could be unpredictable, but he had never imagined it would turn against them in such a way. He had worked hard to maintain it, to ensure that it would continue to provide for those who depended on it. But now he wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on. "I don't know what to do," the rancher admitted, his voice filled with frustration. "I've tried everything, but the land won't listen." The chief nodded, understanding the rancher's frustration. "The land will not listen if we do not listen to it," the chief said quietly. "We must find a way to work together, to restore the balance." The rancher had never thought about the land in such a way. He had always seen it as something to be controlled, something to be worked. But now, with the chief's words, he realized that the land was not something to be tamed. It was something to be respected, nurtured, and cared for. The chief's people had always understood this connection, this bond with the earth. It was something the rancher had never fully grasped until now. "I will do whatever it takes," the rancher said, his voice firm. "I will work with you. Together, we can find a way." The chief smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "Together, we will succeed. But we must first listen to the land, hear its needs, and understand what it requires from us." The rancher and the chief worked side by side in the following days, doing everything they could to restore the land. The rancher, once a solitary figure, now found himself relying on the tribe's wisdom and knowledge. The chief's people knew how to work with the earth, how to care for it in ways the rancher had never learned. They shared their methods of irrigation, of planting in harmony with the seasons, of working with the land's natural rhythms. The rancher, in turn, taught them how to care for the cattle, how to ensure that the animals were well fed and healthy. Days turned into weeks, and though the land was slow to respond, the rancher began to see signs of hope. The soil, though still dry, seemed to regain some of its vitality. The animals began to grow stronger, their coats shinier, their steps more confident. The rains had not come in full force, but the rancher could feel the land stirring, as if waking up from a long sleep. As the seasons began to change once more, the rancher felt a sense of renewal, both within himself and within the land. He no longer saw the land as something he could control, but as something he needed to care for. It was no longer just his land. It was the land of the tribe as well, and they shared in its care, its burdens, and its rewards. One day, as the rancher stood at the edge of the fields watching the first real rain in months fall gently onto the soil, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The rain was not just water. It was a symbol of the bond he had formed with the chief's people, with the land, and with the future. It was a sign that their hard work, their shared efforts had paid off. The children, too, seemed to sense the change. They ran through the fields, laughing and playing in the rain, their joy echoing through the land. The rancher watched them, a smile tugging at his lips. He had never known what it was like to see children grow up on the land, to see them learn and play and live with it. But now, as he watched the children of the tribe, he saw the future unfolding before him. The rancher turned to the chief, who had appeared beside him, his expression peaceful. "We've done it," the rancher said, his voice filled with relief and pride. "The land is healing." The chief nodded, his eyes full of wisdom. "It is not just the land that is healing," he said quietly. "It is all of us. We are all connected to this earth, and when we work together, when we listen to the land, we heal." The rancher knew that this was true. The work had not been easy, but it had been worth it. The future, once uncertain, now seemed full of promise. The tribe's children, the future generations, would inherit this land, just as they had inherited the stories and traditions of their ancestors. And the rancher, though he had no children of his own, knew that his legacy would live on, through the land and through the knowledge he had shared. As the rain continued to fall, the rancher stood beside the chief, watching the children play, knowing that this was only the beginning. The land was healing, and with it, a new chapter of their shared story was unfolding, one that would be carried on for generations to come. As the years passed, the rancher found himself living a life that was far different from the one he had imagined when he first agreed to let the chief's people stay on his land. The simple, quiet life he had once cherished had now become a shared existence, full of meaning, community, and connection. The once solitary rancher now spent his days working alongside the chief's people, passing on his knowledge to the next generation, and learning new ways to live in harmony with the earth. The rancher's bond with the land had deepened in ways he could never have anticipated. The work had become easier, not because it had gotten less difficult, but because it was now shared. The tribe, with their deep respect for nature and their understanding of the land, had taught him to look at the earth not as something to conquer, but as something to nurture. They worked together, side by side, respecting the rhythms of nature, knowing that everything had its place, and that nothing could be rushed. The land, which had once seemed stubborn and unyielding, had started to respond to their collective efforts. The soil, once dry and cracked, had become softer, richer. The animals, which had once struggled to survive in the harsh conditions, were thriving. The rancher had watched the land transform, but more than that, he had watched himself transform. He had grown from a man who worked alone, driven only by his own need to survive, to a man who understood the importance of community, connection, and legacy. The children, too, had grown. The rancher had seen them change, not just in stature, but in spirit. They had become strong, independent, and full of purpose. The boy he had taught had become a young man, skilled in the ways of the land and the animals, and ready to take on more responsibility. He had become a reflection of the rancher's own younger self, but with a deeper understanding of what it meant to care for the earth. The boy, now a young man, had learned not only how to work the land, but how to respect it. He had learned that his actions on the earth had consequences, and that the earth in turn would provide for those who cared for it. The rancher had never had children of his own, but in the tribe's children, he had found the family he never knew he needed. They were his legacy. The chief's words had come true, in a way the rancher had never expected. "They will bear you children," the chief had said. And though the rancher had thought the chief meant it in the literal sense, he had come to realize that it was not about blood. It was about passing on knowledge, tradition, and the respect for the land. The children of the tribe and the rancher's adopted children would carry his legacy forward. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the rancher found himself standing by the barn, watching the boy-turned young man work with the cattle. The rancher felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. The young man moved with confidence, with skill, handling the cattle with ease. The rancher had taught him everything he knew, but now he was watching the boy take on the role of the rancher with a quiet grace. It was then that the rancher realized the true meaning of his life. It wasn't about the cattle, the crops, or the land. It was about the legacy he would leave behind. The young man, the tribe's children, and the future generations would carry forward the lessons he had learned, the lessons he had taught them. The rancher was no longer just a solitary figure in the land. He had become a part of a much larger story, a story that would continue long after he was gone. The chief came to him that evening, his steps slow and deliberate. The rancher turned to him, and the two men shared a quiet moment of understanding. The chief had been a steady presence in the rancher's life, guiding him through the challenges they had faced together. They had both learned from each other, and in many ways, the rancher had come to see the chief not just as a leader of his people, but as a close friend, a brother. "We've done well," the chief said quietly, his voice full of pride. The rancher nodded, looking out over the land. "We have," he agreed. "But it's not just about what we've done. It's about what's to come." The chief smiled. "Yes, the future belongs to those who care for the land, those who understand that we are not separate from it, but a part of it." The rancher nodded. The chief's words resonated deeply with him. The earth, the land, the animals, and the people. Everything was interconnected. They were all part of a larger, never-ending cycle. It was a cycle that would continue long after he was gone. As the years went on, the rancher grew older, his body weary from the years of hard work. But his heart was full of the knowledge that he had done his part. He had passed on the lessons he had learned, and he had seen them take root in the children of the tribe and the young man who had become his apprentice. and in the land itself. One day, as the rancher sat by the fire, his hands resting on his knees, he looked out over the fields. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the land. The sound of the cattle grazing, the laughter of the children, and the gentle rustle of the wind in the trees filled the air. It was a peaceful sound, a sound he had never known to appreciate before. The young man came to him then, his face serious, but his eyes filled with warmth. "It's time," he said quietly. The rancher looked at him, unsure of what he meant. But then he understood. It was time for the young man to take his place, to carry on the work, to continue the legacy that had been built. The rancher had always known that this day would come, but now that it was here, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. "You're ready," the rancher said, his voice full of pride. "You've learned everything you need to know." The young man nodded. "I won't let you down," he said quietly. And with that, the rancher knew that his time had come. He had done his part. He had passed on the knowledge, the lessons, and the respect for the land. He had created a legacy, and that legacy would live on, not through his blood, but through the children of the tribe, the young man who had worked beside him, and the earth itself. As the days grew shorter and the rancher grew older, he knew that the work he had started would continue. The future was no longer something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, for it held the promise of a new generation, one that would care for the land, just as he had. And so, as the seasons changed, the rancher's legacy lived on. The land thrived under the care of the next generation, the children he had watched grow, the young man who had learned from him, and the tribe's people who had become part of his family. The rancher had done what he set out to do. He had built a life, a community, and a legacy that would continue long after he was gone.